Welcome back to the Docker command line options section of the Getting Started with Docker course. In this lesson, we're going to be covering some of the bonus command line options that we have available to us. So let's jump right to the command line. Now first, since we have no images and we have no containers, so Docker images is empty and Docker ps-a is empty. So we need to add at least one image and at least one container so we have something to work with for these bonus commands. So let's create a new build. So Docker build, we can do a -f because our Docker file is in c:/temp/Docker file. And we're going to do a -q for quiet and -t for tag, and we'll call it just new -image like before. And latest, and make sure you hit that dot at the end for the current directory being the root that we're going to operate off of. And that's going to create an image file for us. Once that's done, then we'll do a Docker run command. So Docker run -P to just map the ports to some random port on our machine. And then -d for disconnected or detached mode, actually. I keep saying disconnected, but it's detached mode. And then base that off of the new -image. We're not going to give it a name. We're just going to say it's based off the new image. And that's done as well. So now we have Docker image. Oops. Docker images. There we go. We have new image and we have there's new image, we have HTTPD. So we also have our Docker ps-a, which we have one image running. It's kind Kirch, and it's been up for 20 seconds. So it's currently running. And the ports are 32.785 and 32.784. Okay, so now we have one of each. We can start looking at these bonus commands. So the first one is for an image. So let's do a Docker images, and we have two images. Let's look at the history of new -image. So Docker history new -image. And what this does is it shows us the history of this file. Remember that Docker images are layered on top of each other, layer upon layer. And so it starts off here 4 weeks ago, and then we apply certain commands to that, all the way up through to the point where 5 days ago we had this additional 120 megabytes to the file. And then we copied this over, we exposed port 80, and then about a minute ago, we set the working directory, we exposed port 80 and port 443. But this gives you a history of your image and what went on in it. So that might be useful in some cases to look back and see what happened in this image and maybe see, oh, the reason why our port 443 didn't work is because the original image only exposed port 80, not port 443 as well. Okay, so that's a useful command. We can clear the screen. And now let's do a Docker inspect new -image. And this gives us a whole bunch of information. So it gives us our tag, and it gives us some information about whether or not we're attaching the standard in and out or the standard error, what ports are exposed, whether or not the terminal is attached, what the environmental variables are. Remember, this is the image, not a container. So you can see in image what everything is. Okay, and there's a lot of information in here. We can scroll down through even the operating system, the architecture, the size, and more data about it. So a lot of information that you might need on occasion when you're looking at an image. But let's clear the screen and do a docker ps-a and get this kind_kirch. Let's do the same thing, docker inspect kind_kirch. And this looks very, very similar in the fact there's a lot of information here, but it's actually about a container. So for example, status is running. Running is true. It's not. Restart policy currently is set to no, and the maximum retry count is 0. And it's not set to auto remove. So there's a lot of information in here you can kind of glean from this that maybe you didn't, maybe you're getting an image from somewhere else, you don't know what the information's all about. You can pop in here and look through this and understand an awful lot about how this is set up. If it has quotas like CPU quota or disk quota, you can look at that. And there's just so much here. The mounts, anything that's mounted to it, the terminal if it's turned on, network settings. So here is the ports that are mapped. This is the gateway for the internal network. This is its IP address for its internal network, because you can actually have more than one container talk to each other, and they can have different IP addresses. And this is how you identify, okay, this is the IP address internally of this container if it wants to talk directly to another container. All right, so there's a lot of information with docker inspect. Now, instead of docker inspect, let's clear the screen and do a docker ps-a. I don't need to do a -a, but I do it out of habit, because we're only looking at running containers because we only have one container and it's running. But just out of habit, so I don't forget sometimes to do it, I always do a -a. So I can say docker port kind_kirch. Or I can do that 3356 or just 335 to indicate the container by ID. Either one is fine. So this docker port, instead of doing the docker inspect and getting all the information and looking for the port information, this just gives us those two ports. This is especially helpful when you're doing the -P, because of the fact that these ports are generated randomly. Or I want to say, it says randomly, but it's not quite random, because obviously these are they're in line one after the other in order. But there's not a set pattern to it as far as from this time to next time. It's not a predictable thing that we say, okay, since it was 1 last time, this time it's 2. It's not how it works. So, but with this docker port and the name of your container, your running container, it will tell you which ports are being mapped from the host into the container. or in this case, the other way around, I guess. So from the container out to the host. Okay, so Docker port, and that only works for containers, not for images. Now the other one is maybe I just hate that name kind_Kirch. And I want to call it my hello world instead. Well, I can do a Docker rename kind_Kirch to be hello_world. Hit enter. And now if I clear the screen and do a Docker ps-a, notice it hasn't affected the runtime. It's been up for 8 minutes, so it's continued to run. But now my name is hello_world. So really quick, Docker rename, and then give it the old name of the container and the new name of the container, and it will rename that container for you. Okay, so there's 4 commands that can help you out. Docker history gives you the history of an image, not a container, just an image. Docker inspect can inspect a container or an image. Docker port looks at the ports of a running container. And then Docker rename can rename a container. Okay, so there's those 4 extra bonus commands that can really be helpful for diagnosing things, for real quick fixes like this rename, or for just understanding what's going on with your system. And with that, we've covered the major commands on the command line for Docker. Now, sure, there's some more edge case things that you probably won't do very often. And quite frankly, what will happen is when you need to do it, then you'll look it up in the help file, because it's not something you're going to memorize, these edge cases. But for a lot of the common things that we're doing, you'll probably memorize them over time as you dive into using Docker. And I definitely would encourage you, as you're going through this, make sure you're practicing. Do what I do. Make sure you get that muscle memory of typing out these commands, because then it gets really quick to do Docker images, if I can type it right, Docker images, and get the image information, and the Docker ps-a, and you get the running containers. And you can do, let's clean it up now. Why not? Docker stop 335. There's no running container, because that's interesting. Docker ps-a, Docker stop 355, not 335. There we go. And Docker remove 355. Actually, let's do remove hello_world, just to show you can do both ways. And now Docker ps-a, nothing's there. Docker images, and we could do the full system prune if we wanted to. So, or we can just do the Docker RMI new -image. And I can do that because the tag is latest, therefore I didn't need a specified tag. Where if I do Docker RMI HTTPD, that won't work because it says no such image, even though it's right there. And the reason why is because the tag is Alpine, not latest. So Docker RMI HTTPD, and then Alpine. And now Docker images lists nothing. Docker ps-a lists nothing. So we're cleaned up back to square one. We're back to nothing on our system. So as you can see, those commands over time, I don't have to look back and figure those commands out. Now, every once in a while I make a mistake, but for the most part, those commands come pretty easily because I've been working with Docker for a while. As you get used to working with Docker, some of these things will just come easier and easier. But don't be afraid to look at the reference guide. And that's why I've linked for you this site right here, which is where you have all these different commands, so that when you're thinking about, well, what does Docker kill do again, you can look at that, see what it does, how it works, and what the command line looks like. Okay. And especially if you get into the Docker run and you want to go off the beaten path and do something a little extra. So if you want to block I/O weight, relative device weight, well, then there's the command to do it. When's the last time I've done that? I've never done that. Okay. So you look up these commands, you have it all here, and you can kind of read through and go, okay, that's how I do that. So don't be afraid to use this to, bookmark it, to put it in your favorites, so you have this reference and you can use it over and over again to refer back to the ones that you're not using all the time. Okay, I'm not a big proponent of trying to memorize everything. What I prefer to do is know where everything is as far as how I can find it or what questions to ask to find it. And then I find that as I use something, and that's part of the thing is you have to practice, but as I use things, the commands that I use most often, I memorize without thinking about it. I just get so that muscle memory goes, okay, Docker images. But I've done that hundreds of times. So that I don't have to think about which ones should I memorize. They just come naturally because they're the ones that I use all the time. Also, my process becomes faster and faster because of the fact that I'm, without thinking about it, memorizing the things that I use most. Therefore, most of my commands I've memorized. Okay? So basically, practice, 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 and that will help you out a lot. Okay? So let's head right into the wrap up for this particular section.